On this Saturday afternoon here in British Columbia. I wanted to touch on a couple of subjects. One of the problems we have in dealing with reality is very often that people misunderstand, either accidentally or sometimes on purpose, when reality doesn't match a given ideology or a favorite mythology or something that was taught in earlier centuries when it was thought to be the truth. It turns out, with scientific advances and historic advances in archaeology and things, turned out not to be the truth. Not that there was anything wrong or nefarious in what was taught in former times. It was simply believed to be the truth and turned out not to be. That's one of the difficulties we run up against. I'm going to touch on a subject like that. First, I want to mention the quarrel between the ultra-right wing and modern science, and the idea that things are always categorized as left-wing, right-wing, liberal, or not liberal when they're dealing with hard science. And that's, of course, a serious error. We have, of course, the ongoing debate about climate change, global warming and climate change. But let's put that particular issue aside for a moment and take a look at the biggest catastrophe coming along in the world as a whole. And that's one that nobody in any wing can deny or turn away from. And that's the collapse of fresh water supplies, the expansion of desert areas, desertification, the loss of irrigation water, which is the basis of the economy of whole countries such as the Kingdom of Jordan. More than 13 million wells have been abandoned in India in the last decade because the water table has gone in so many parts of India. The aquifer's not there, the water isn't there. There's some shift and change in the monsoons. They don't restore the aquifers. It takes hundreds of thousands of years to build an aquifer. You can't restore it with a couple of heavy rainfalls. And the, of course, increased use of water. Las Vegas, Nevada, for example, not one of the 5 largest cities in the United States, but one of the 5 largest users of water in the world for a per capita basis. Not only the vast irrigation for people's lawns, trees, the fountains that run, and the swimming pools where the water is, lost. This water can't be replaced so easily, and it is creating catastrophe. The orange groves in the Kingdom of the Jordan, other fruit that are grown there, which are a major source of income through the exports, can hardly be irrigated anymore. The Jordan River has come down to a trickle, so that the Dead Sea drops a meter, I think it's a meter, every year, something like that, because there's not enough water coming in from the Jordan River anymore to feed it. And this, of course, poses a huge economic problem for Palestine as well as for Israel. Perhaps Israel actually takes an inordinate amount of the water from the upper Jordan, more than it really should, more than is really fair, but anyway, that's how nations work. But for Syria, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority area, these economic tragedies that are coming about because of the lack of water, and the idea that builds constantly on the notion that future wars will be wars over water. This is something that's imminent, and whether one talks about global warming or not isn't part of this particular issue. The aquifers are simply vanishing, can't be replaced. Rainfall belts have certainly shifted, and you have increased desertification in various parts of Africa and northern China, and huge areas where the water simply isn't there anymore. Part of it is the misuse of water, as in the two Dario rivers that flow into the Aral Sea. So much of the water was diverted for growing cotton that the Aral Sea began to dry up. And bits of it have been restored now. That's a possibility, you see, in cases like that. But where the aquifers vanished, that's something that can't be dealt with so easily. And it's a major problem. And what can be done about it is practically anyone's guess. But it has to be resolved by science, you see. It can't be resolved by ideology. And it can't be resolved by religion either. It has to be resolved, if there is a resolution. It has to come from some good hard science. So we ought not to be in such a rush to denigrate science. Now, coming to the other subject, also dealing with science and religion. When, decades ago, an acquaintance of mine, a bishop, wrote a book and in which he made an analogy between particles and the Holy Trinity. Never mind that analogies between the created and the uncreated were condemned as heretical. Augustine's Analogia was actually condemned in the person of John Italos, who brought those ideas into Greece. And one of the things that we kind of warn people who are writing on these subjects is don't make any hard and fast statements or declarations. And by all means, don't set out trying to use science to prove either one's theology or one's mythologies or one's ideology. We can find enough things that will substantiate many of our beliefs, many of our approaches to theology. But if we start out with that intention, then we're going to end up cooking the books on it. We can't make all the absolute statements that we make. And one of those things that I'm still comes up time and time again is whether the story of the creation narrative is literally true or not. Whether there was death before 8,000 years ago, whether anything lived and died before 8,000 years ago. Well, of course, we know it did. And the other thing is about the origins of sexual intercourse. Now, generally in our religious circles, particularly in some Orthodox circles, human sexuality and sexual intercourse are treated with what can only be described as neurotic fetishes or neurotic fears, genuine neuroses that sometimes pass into something very much worse. The idea that reproduction by intercourse was a product of the fall of mankind 8,000 years ago, for example. When one makes a statement like that, one undermines the Orthodox faith. One undermines the validity of the scripture. One undermines religion. Because the statements are so patently untrue. We know very well that things have been living and dying for more than 3 billion years on the face of the earth. That sexual reproduction developed probably 3 billion years ago, and developed when eukaryote cells, the haploids, for whatever means, merged together and formed a diploid, and then shared genetic material, and then, as cells are wont to do, split back into haploids, carrying genetic material from each other, proved to be very advantageous. So it became an evolutionary reality because it was very advantageous to development. And this was happening. I'm not sure what the dynamic was that merged the two cells, but in any case they did. And that was the beginning of what we call sexual reproduction, in which all the cells would generally be classed as female, who were doing the reproduction. Reproduction by through differentiated genitalia began, roughly 350, 375 million years ago. And that would have been the late Devonian period. And we know pretty well in which creatures it began. It really in Placidorum sea life, when genitalia actually began to develop. And instead of reproducing through graspers, there was actual penetration with, per se, a pre-penis in some members of the species. And in any case, the internal birth then began to be developed through embryos, because by that time eggs had begun to be developed. But in any case, this is fairly clear, and not much question about it. The other thing, though, is in reproductive science, reproductive systems, we also have a great deal of mythology, which is only slowly being discharged. The idea, for example, that the male sperm was the sum total of what reproduced a new child, and that the child was the man's child or the husband's child, because the woman was only an incubator. And it wasn't until the invention of the microscope that people actually became aware of, and the discovery of eggs, female eggs, that actually the egg is the major part of reproduction. The sperm is simply an incomplete cell, as a matter of fact, that fertilizes the egg and adds some genetic material, so that there's a mix of genetic material, which is very advantageous to evolution. That this began to take place. But there's no mystery and magic to these things either, because scientists have actually created a female ovum, a female egg, using skin tissue. And this takes place in mammals. So the movement now in reproductive science for women who are sterile, instead of harvesting eggs, which can be very difficult, and then many of them wouldn't be functional anyway, the experimentation now is simply, we know that the female eggs can be developed simply from skin tissue, then been done in mice. That these are mammals, so likely human female eggs can be developed simply from skin tissue. And this will enter into reproductive science. I don't think it'll ever be viable. I think far too complex and too expensive. But in any case, there is an experiment moving that way, and it's going to be proved that female eggs can indeed be developed from skin tissue of a female. Now, the reason I want to mention these things again, when we discuss these developments, discoveries, all these things, some people will react with hysteria and accusations and heresy and this sort of thing. But what's true cannot be heresy. Only what's false can be heresy. These things happen to be true, so they cannot be heresies. And the reality is there before us. To deny it, and as the English say, whistle past the graveyard about these things, or to make overly dogmatic or absolutist statements when one is writing about such matters, really undermines the faith. It undermines the scripture, and it undermines, really, the Orthodox faith itself. It's better to face the truth and deal with it in some reasonable and sane manner than to simply get hysterical or howl and shriek or make remonstrance or accuse people of heresy because they've discovered something uncomfortable or something which one doesn't like or something which contradicts one's preconceived ideologies and that sort of thing. I just wanted to mention that as a way of, I suppose, warning, but also of calling people's attention to what it is that actually undermines the faith and undermines people's regard for Scripture. It's not these things we discover which are true, but the way fundamentalist Christians, including in the Orthodox Church, the way they respond to those truths. This is what undermines the validity of Scripture in people's minds, and what undermines the faith itself in people's hearts. So we just wanted to caution people to please don't overreact when something new is discovered, or that perhaps is uncomfortable with one's model of reality, but to re-examine it in the light of the principles of Scripture and the principles of the faith, not making declarations about concrete, absolute fact. And we can advance the faith in the current generation much better, much more effectively that way. Thank you, and God bless you.